Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, Ricardo Lopes, as always, and today I'm here with Dr. Daniel Everett. He is trustee professor of cognitive sciences at Bentley University. He is well known for his many years of field research among the Pirahã people of the Brazilian Amazon jungle. Dr. Everett's books include Dark Matter of the Mind and How Language Began the Story of Humanity's Greatest Invention. So, Dr. Everett, thank you a lot for taking the time to come on the show. It's a real pleasure to have you on.
Oh, it's a great pleasure to be with you as well and to chat with you this morning.
Okay, thank you. So let me first ask you this, because I guess that there is still a little bit of controversy when it comes to the evolutionary basis of language, if I'm not mistaken. But before we get into that specifically, what would you say is the relationship between communication and language?
Well, this is like everything when we talk about language, it's controversial. So communication, in my theory of how this works, is the transfer of information by signs, and language is the transfer of information by symbols.
Mm-hmm. And could you tell us what is the difference between signs and symbols?
Yes, in Charles Peirce's theory of signs or semiotics, there are three types of signs. There are indexes, icons, and symbols. So symbols are a special type of sign. An index is physically connected to the thing that it refers to. So a footprint was physically made by an animal. That's an index of that animal. If I smell something, that's an index. If I see smoke, that's an index of fire. Something that looks like something else is an icon. So if I see a reflection in the water, that's an icon of my face. If a picture is an icon, any sort of vague resemblance. So all animals use indexes and icons. They couldn't survive without recognizing similarities and recognizing physical connections of one thing to another. But symbols are elements in which an object is represented by some sort of physical sign. It could be a gesture, it could be a spoken word, and that is linked by cultural convention. So the biggest difference here is that icons are based on physical resemblance, indexes are based on physical connection, and symbols are based on cultural convention. So the claim is that only humans have culture, only humans can make signs based on cultural conventions, therefore only humans have language.
Mm-hmm. Only humans have language, so that means that there are other species that have communicative systems but not language, in the sense that they are not able to use symbols. Is that correct?
That's correct. In fact, I would say that all animals communicate. In fact, Charles Peirce would have said that everything communicates. Trees communicate with the environment. That's how they know when to start shedding their leaves. So communication is widespread throughout the world, although language seems to be restricted to our species.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's now get a little bit into the evolution of language. There are several different hypotheses out there. There are people that, for example, say that language is an adaptation, a biological adaptation, not even a cultural one, that language basically has evolved because of the fact that humans were exposed to some specific selective pressures during our evolutionary history. But as far as I understand it, in your work, you suggest that language is not an adaptation, or that hasn't, to put it in other words, that we don't have a specific cognitive tool in our minds that has evolved, or that is the result of evolutionary processes that we can call language. Is that a fair assessment, or?
Well, it's often claimed that the big difference between views, or say my view and the views of some others on language evolution, is whether it's nature or nurture, whether language is the result of the genes or language is the result of culture. Obviously, language rests on a biological foundation. If it didn't rest on a biological foundation, we would have no explanation for why humans have symbols, for example, and other creatures don't. The question isn't whether there is something biologically special about humans. The question is whether that biological specialness is specific to language. And so if you believe in a hypothesis such as universal grammar, you believe that there is a biological adaptation on the genes that enables humans to have grammar, for example. On the other hand, in my view, humans are unlike other creatures because we have big brains, we are bipedal, we have a number of characteristics that have enabled us to develop culture and communication to a much higher level and enabled us to invent symbols. So that both of these views rest on the idea that humans are biologically different from other creatures. But my view is that aside from that, there's nothing clearly special about language. It is one of the many tools that we have cognitively that set us apart. I mean, we're the only creatures that can make beer. I mean, there are all sorts of things we can do that other creatures can't do. Language is one of those things.
Mm-hmm. So would you say that you reject the view coming from universal grammar?
Yes, I think that there are two objections that I have to universal grammar. First, I don't think grammar is all that important. I think that human languages are not defined based on a specific type of grammar, but on the existence of symbols. Grammar is a later addition that can be more or less complex depending on the needs of the society. And I also don't find any evidence that grammar appeared suddenly through some sort of mutation, or that it's specifically related to one or a set of genes. Language seems to have developed gradually in some respects, and it seems to be within the capabilities of any species of the genus Homo.
So, I mean, in terms of evolutionary history, you would go back to Homo erectus when trying to explain the origins of language.
Yes, I think that the physical and mental characteristics we can find evidence for in Homo erectus illustrate not only that they would have been capable of language, but that their many accomplishments indicate that they did in fact have language.
And what would be some of those accomplishments?
There are numerous accomplishments. We see it in the development of their tools, the fact that some of their tools go beyond the merely functional aspects of tool making to aspects that show regional variation, that show cultural values of tools. We see it in the way that they transport their tools and plan for the future. We see it in the way that they operate together as a group in the kinds of settlements they made. Some of the 750,000 plus year old settlements of Homo erectus show hierarchical structure in the village and planning and different tasks. We also see it in the fact that the ocean never seems to have been a barrier for Homo erectus. They are found about 750 to 800,000 years ago. Homo erectus started crossing the ocean. They went to Socotra, they went to Flores, they went to the Philippines, they went to Crete. And for all of these different abilities, it seems that language would have been required for them to accomplish some of these very complicated tasks.
So do you think that all of these sources of evidence that you just pointed to would make a solid case for Homo erectus being able to use language?
I would say that language is the simplest explanation that we have for their abilities in these areas. These don't prove that they had language, but they're very difficult to explain if they didn't have language.
So, I mean, in terms of our biology and perhaps more specifically our cognition, is there a set of traits that we had to evolve in order to be able to produce and comprehend language?
Yes, there are a number of abilities we would have needed. We would have needed, for one thing, brains of a certain neuronal density. I mean, if we look at, if we look at gorillas and chimpanzees, or even dogs, we see that they can be taught symbols. They don't invent symbols, but they can be taught symbols, the use of symbols. And our brains are far more powerful by any measure. So the average chimpanzee brain is about 450 cc's in size. The average Homo sapiens brain is about 1,200 to 1,300 cc's. The average Homo erectus brain would have been about 950 to 1,100 cc's, and the average Neanderthal brain would have been around 1,400. So although brain size doesn't directly indicate intelligence, in the case of hominin evolution, it does show that we are much smarter than creatures that can be taught symbols. So Homo erectus certainly could have been taught symbols, and almost certainly invented symbols. And it seems well within their cognitive reach given the other things they were doing. In fact, we find evidence of symbolic representation in their tools.
It's interesting that you refer to other primate species because, as far as I know, over the years there have been people that tried to teach some of these species, like for example gorillas and chimpanzees, to use sign language, and they were able to use it at least to a certain extent. But could you tell us what were some of the limitations in that domain? I mean, in what ways were they able to use sign language, and in what ways were they limited?
Well, they were able to use sign language in the sense of learning symbols and learning the correct symbols for certain things that they wanted, and that means that they were able to learn a bit of language. By my definition, that means that they were not just communicating, but they were communicating via language, but a very simple form of language that lacked complex grammar, and it lacked, more importantly than complex grammar, they lacked the ability to create among themselves new symbols, to invent symbols. And this seems to be the crucial distinguishing characteristic between our species and other species. Now, if you're a believer in universal grammar, you would say that they learn nothing like language. They just imitated some things, and symbols are pretty much irrelevant. If language is defined in terms of human grammar, then only humans have it. That's just a truism. So it doesn't really predict much. But if you believe that human grammars vary dramatically among current populations of humans, and that the primary distinguishing characteristic of language is the presence and the invention of symbols, then other animals can be taught something like human language. And these are important experiments. How much can they be taught? Where does it break down? So there is a big divide as to whether, if you think that these experiments are showing us something, and they show specific things about animal limitations, then you're pretty much Darwinian in your view of the gradual evolution of language. If you believe that only humans have it, that it's not found in, nothing like language is found in any other species. That is not a Darwinian perspective, and which those people would happily admit. Um, and and you would think that experiments with other species are pretty much pointless.
I remember reading in your books about different types of languages, G1, G2, and G3 types of language. Could you tell us about that? What are the differences between them, and maybe why the fact that these different types of language exist make a case against universal grammar?
Well, so I'll start by defining them. A G1 language would be a language in which symbols are simply placed in an agreed upon order. So John sees Mary. There's no, let's say there's no other structure. It's just three words, John sees Mary. And John sees Mary go to the store. These could be G1 grammars. A G2 grammar is a grammar that has order, but it also has structure. So John wants very badly to see Mary. So very badly is probably part of the verb phrase to see Mary. And there's a subject phrase and a verb phrase. So once you start to see this kind of hierarchical structure of noun phrases and verb phrases, that would be what I call a G2 language. And a G3 language would be have all three: linear order, hierarchical structure, and recursion. Recursion and hierarchy have been demonstrated outside of linguistics to be extremely useful in the processing and expression of information and information rate. So we expect that recursion and hierarchy will be found in lots of languages, maybe most languages, because of the efficiency in the processing of symbols that they provide, but they're not required. And so universal grammar, as currently, as most of its advocates would propose, could only be related to G3 grammars. There wouldn't be any such thing as a G1 or a G2 grammar. All languages would have to have recursion. And if that's the case, then no language without recursion is a human language. But I believe that there are human languages that lack recursion, and that Homo erectus could have had any one of these types of, we don't know whether they had recursion or not, but the point is they didn't need recursion, and they didn't even need hierarchy. As soon as you've got symbols and put them in an order, you can communicate anything that the other languages can communicate.
Could we say that moving from a G1 to a G2 and to a G3 type of language, that they get increasingly more complex, or not?
They get more complex syntactically, but there are various ways to judge or to evaluate the complexity of a language. One is, a simple one would be the number of words they have. If you have 1,000 words and I have 500 words, in some sense your language is more complicated than mine. If you have 100 sounds and I have 3 sounds, then in some ways your language is more complicated than mine. If you have recursion and I don't have recursion, in that sense your language is more complicated than mine. But when you evaluate the overall complexity, so for example, take the Pirahã language, where I've claimed that there is no evidence for syntactic recursion. Well, syntactically it would be simple, but the word structure is extremely complex. So in English we have 5 forms for each word: sing, sang, sung, singing, sings. Not all words even have 5 forms. But in Pirahã, every verb has 65,000 plus forms possible. So they have a much more complicated word structure than English. So is that a more complex language? If you look at the word structure, Pirahã is far more complex than English. If you look at the syntactic structure, Pirahã is simpler than English. So it really depends on how you measure complexity, and I'm not aware that any linguist has come up with a good method of evaluating the overall complexity of a language.
Do you know if there are any patterns in terms of language distribution? So, for example, would it be the case that G1 languages occur mostly in more traditional societies, like, for example, hunter-gatherers or horticulturalists, and then G3 languages occur more frequently in more modern societies. I mean, are there any patterns like that?
Well, not obviously. You find very complicated grammars among some hunter-gatherers. If even in the Amazon, I've written a grammar of the Wadi language, which is unrelated to Pirahã, but it's only maybe 200 miles away, and it has extremely complicated recursion. I would argue even more complicated than English. But on the other hand, it would not surprise me to find that there are correlates of particular cultural characteristics and linguistic characteristics. It's just difficult to do that based on the data that we have now, because most people who consider themselves anthropologists don't look at language, and most people who consider themselves linguists don't look at culture. So that's a function of the desire of everyone to specialize. But you can't really get at these questions until the field, either you have a team of researchers go, or you have one person who is trained in these areas, which, 75 years ago, this is how a linguist or an anthropologist would have been trained. An anthropologist would have done linguistics as well, and a linguist would have done anthropology as well. And part of the message of what I'm trying to get across in my work is that this may be the way we should be training people today as well.
Mm-hmm. So, would it be possible that the fact that different societies have these three different types of languages would derive from some sort of cultural evolution?
Well, the cultural evolution definitely exists. And the more complex your society becomes, the more complex the concepts become. I mean, physics is not likely to appear as a theory among hunter-gatherers, not because they're not as smart, they just simply don't need it. So as soon as you start to develop these forms of very specialized knowledge, you need special ways of talking about them. You develop jargon, the syntax becomes more complicated, especially it's funny that some people who object that culture can't affect grammar overlook the obvious fact of literacy. As soon as we learn to read and write, which is a cultural change, our sentences become more complicated because we don't have to remember them. We can just go back and read them. And so if I have recursion in a sentence, that means I can put more information in that single sentence. If I'm speaking it, it may be hard to keep track of all that's being said because I'm trying to listen and there's stuff going on in the environment. But if it's written, I can go back to it and see it, and there's no problem. So unsurprisingly, very often our written communication is more complicated than our spoken communication, which is culture affecting language. So there is a direct relationship between culture and language, but it is highly variable because culture varies so tremendously from one society to another. A society is a group of people, and the culture is what keeps those people together. The values and the knowledge structures and the social roles. And these are the things that, if you value more information faster, which is a possible value, you're going to have different syntax than if you value slower information. And that's going to, whether you value one or the other, is going to depend in part on your external environment as well as other things.
So even though you don't think that the evidence supports universal grammar, would you say that there are any universal traits to language, but maybe not the ones identified by the people who support that theory?
Well, all languages have to have a way of distinguishing events from things. So our symbols have to include verb-like things, and they have to include noun-like things, because language is about communication of events and structures of events and about individuals. So we have to be able to distinguish individuals and events. We have to have ideas of generality. There has to be a generic term and a specific term in a language. Languages need to be able to distinguish between dog as a species and individual dogs. So if we think about it, and all languages have to have a physical way of manifesting themselves. So it could be consonants and vowels, or it could be hand gestures, but you can't have a language based strictly on mental telepathy, given the way that we are constructed. I wouldn't say that other things are universal. So, for example, all languages have to have sentences of a certain type or words of a certain type, apart from these very general things that I mentioned. And the way you get at that is to think about what the function of language is, and then what do you need to fulfill that function, and how are the various ways that you could fulfill the same function by different means. So most studies, or some, I shouldn't say most studies, there are some significant studies that indicate that there are no language universals in the sense that some people think of them. But you have to be careful there, because take Chomsky's view. When he claims that X is a language universal, he does not always mean that X is found in every language. He means that all people are capable of producing X. That's a reasonable position, but it's very difficult to test, because if you say that a particular trait, let's say recursion, is required for language to emerge, but it's not actually required to appear in any specific language, it's not clear what you're claiming. There doesn't seem to be any empirical content to that claim. So if you say that there are language universals that don't actually have to be universal, which is the claim that is made by some, they're universal in capability but not universal in application, then it becomes more difficult to test what you're saying, and that makes it less interesting.
I would imagine that if we were to put any child from whatever place in a given society and expose it to any type of language, that she would be able to learn it, right? So, I mean, would that mean that, if everyone is able to learn any language, that there is a set of cognitive traits that are specialized for language learning, or that the traits that allow for that are more domain general and simply that all people have them?
As I point out in Language, the Cultural Tool, and also in Dark Matter of the Mind, universal grammar makes the startling prediction that not all people are capable of learning all languages. And the reason it makes this prediction is that if language is on the genes, and we know that genes mutate, and you can get, so if you take the ability to digest milk, known as lactase persistence or lactose tolerance, most adults, most human adults, in fact most mammals, once they reach adulthood, can no longer digest milk. They can't process the sugar, lactose, that is in milk. But we do know that over a period of about 6,000 to 7,000 years, certain societies that were based on dairy farming in Africa and in Northern Europe, adults developed the ability to process milk. In other words, the enzyme that breaks down lactose persists through adulthood, which shows that culture can actually affect biology. So we would expect, if language were carried on the genes, that certain cultures would favor languages of a certain type, so that you would actually people who developed genes to make acquiring this or that language more quickly learnable over a period of, say, 6,000 years, because we know that genes can be adapted that quickly, we would predict that people from that culture couldn't learn a language in another culture. But we don't find any examples like this. But if I'm correct that it's domain general knowledge and not specific characteristics of the genes that are dedicated to language, then we predict that everybody can learn every language. And that seems to be what we find. It would be great evidence for universal grammar, ironically, if you could find one population that couldn't learn the language of another population. That would be great evidence that it's genetic. But the fact that we don't expect to find such things, and we never have found such things, is evidence that it's not specifically genetic for language.
When it comes to the neuroscience of language, people usually refer to areas of the brain like Broca's area and the Wernicke's area. But is it the case that those areas are really specialized for language production and comprehension, or not?
There are a lot of interesting things to say about that. And so Broca's area, which was the first one proposed, it's interesting that Broca, the psychologist that made this claim, if you look at the subject that he was basing this on, it wasn't even the area we currently know as Broca's area that was responsible. But Broca's area and Wernicke's area are both implicated in language, but they're not where language is located. The best recent work that I'm aware of is by Evelina Federico at Massachusetts Institute of Technology, Brain and Cognitive Sciences. And she has a series of fascinating experiments that show that language is localized in networks in the brain that seem to be the same network across languages and across subjects and across genders. So there are specific areas of the brain, not one specific area, but various areas that seem to be dedicated to language and specifically to language. This, of course, doesn't imply that language is innate, because ultimately everything I know has to be someplace in my brain. But it does indicate that Broca's area and Wernicke's area are simplifications. They're really not where language is found these days. I mean, most people would not say that language is found in Broca's area. They would say that Broca's area is somehow implicated in some language tasks.
So, I mean, would the correct way of thinking about it be that there are maybe neural circuits from different areas of the brain that participate in language?
It's a little more specialized than that. That's what I actually would have thought until I saw Federico's experiments. But what she shows is that these networks that specialize for language are not used for other things. They're not used for arithmetic. They're not used for music. They're used only for language. If we call the other ones Broca's area and Wernicke's area, maybe we should call these Federico's networks, because she's discovered something that I don't think anyone else has recognized. So they're specialized for language. They're not for other tasks, which in itself is interesting. And they're not found in just one area of the brain, but they are found in the same regions across all subjects.
Mm-hmm. When it comes to the cultural evolution of language, isn't it the case that many times it is difficult to distinguish between different languages? Because, I mean, as far as I know, it's only very recently, historically speaking, that in different nations people came up with official languages, right? Because before that there were languages, but they varied from region to region, place to place. So I mean, before maybe the 19th century or the 18th century or something like that, was there even one single language that we could call English or Portuguese or Spanish. So, do you understand what I'm trying to
Yeah. I mean, I
ask
don't
you?
think that today. I mean, um, those are abstractions. To call something English or Portuguese is an abstraction, and so below languages are things called dialects. And then each individual has their own speech characteristics. We call those idiolects. And then a group of individuals will share a number of speech characteristics. We call those dialects. And then what's the difference between a dialect and a language? Some people have said that a language is a dialect with an army and a navy. So it is basically a political decision to say that this dialect represents a language and that one doesn't. But if we let's say you start in the Netherlands and drive from the Netherlands across Germany, the language will be constantly changing. You'll be going from one dialect to another. And in fact, the Dutch spoken on the border with Germany is going to be more like German than it is Dutch found in other parts of the Netherlands, perhaps. And the same thing if you go from Argentina into Brazil, the Spanish spoken at the border and the Portuguese spoken at the border are more alike than the Portuguese on the border with Argentina is with the Portuguese spoken in the Amazon. And there certainly are grammatical characteristics that differ dramatically between Iberian Portuguese and South American Portuguese, Brazilian Portuguese. So these are dialects, but there are political reasons for calling them the same language. I remember once when I was in Europe watching a television program, I was going through the dial because so many European languages were on that same television, and I was really enjoying it. And I got to this one language, and I said, that sounds familiar, but I don't know what language is that. And then I realized, oh, that's Portuguese, because it was not Brazilian Portuguese, and it took me a while to make the adjustments. So it was clearly, to most people, it would be considered the same language, but I can tell you that there are many Brazilians who would have a hard time understanding someone from Lisboa, and somebody from Lisboa may not understand someone from Porto Velho. Eventually, they would work it out. So dialects, these are shared characteristics across individuals. Languages are political decisions to make one dialect central and say that these characteristics define the language and these other characteristics do not.
So in linguistics, when you study languages, different languages, what is the approach that you have when distinguishing between them?
Usually, most linguists would say that if two dialects are, if two groups of people are 85% mutually intelligible, then they speak the same language. That's a rough rule of thumb. But again, if you use that, you might say that Spanish and Portuguese are the same language. In fact, one Brazilian anthropologist, Darcy Ribeiro, said that we should just refer to the languages of Latin America as the Latin American language, a lingua latinoamericana, because anybody from Brazil can understand anybody from Argentina. I don't think that's actually true, but that's a claim. But so because they're 85% mutually intelligible, but they don't necessarily identify. So calling something a language, first of all, is based on intelligibility and history, and also the political and psychological attitudes of the speakers towards other speakers. It's not merely a scientific question.
But when you say that the language is intelligible, does that mean that, for example, if someone produces the language, then other people are able to understand what that person says? Or does it entail that other people should also be able to produce the language?
What it means is that if you get two people together talking naturally, the way they grew up talking, and they can understand each other,
okay,
then we can call that the same language. Even though Now, that's assuming that they're not. If you get a Brazilian and an Argentine together, it may be that they've heard each other's languages so much that they can understand. But I'm talking about when they've never heard the other speak.
Okay.
So they get together, they've never heard the other speak, and they can understand each other pretty well. Then we would say that they're speaking the same language, although perhaps different dialects.
Mm-hmm. So let me ask you now about the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. So would you say that language really does change the way we think, or only to a certain extent, or not at all?
The best study of this recently is my son, Caleb Everett, has a book on linguistic relativity, which has a number of experiments. I think what his experiments show and what we know is that the language we speak can affect, in a non-profound way, the way we think about the world. So when we're processing things very quickly, it can affect the way we think. So there are some experiments that show that people like the Pirahã, who have absolute directions, they don't use left or right, right? Because left or right depends on how my body is facing. My left, right now, we're facing each other. So my left is your right is my left. That's confusing. But if I say turn north or turn south, and that's the way we normally talk, then it's not confusing because we always know where north and south is. Languages that work like that, the people who speak those languages tend to be able to navigate in new environments more quickly and more effectively than others. That doesn't mean that I can't learn what north and south are and start to use it. So if you give me enough time, I'll figure it out. But if I already speak a language like that, it will be a natural part of the way I react to the world, so I'll be quicker at it. So it doesn't mean that we've created separate worlds that we can never go into. You know, I can never think about the world the way you do. What it means is that as we're functioning at natural speed, some languages have advantages and in some environments over others. But that if you give human beings enough time to think, they'll figure it all out.
Mm-hmm.
So that they overcome this.
Mm-hmm. So would you say that maybe some major differences between languages in terms of, for example, the example that you just gave, how people orient themselves in space, and maybe sometimes the colors that they talk about and how they talk about time right. and time flow and things like that? Do you think that they were mostly influenced by the types of environments that people lived and evolved in, or other things?
Well, I think if you mean cultural environment, I don't think there's a necessary connection between the physical environment and the design of the grammar. I think that can have an influence. I mean, so for example, if I grew up in a desert, I'm not going to have as many words for plants as if I grow up in the jungle. So in that sense, the physical environment can affect me. But if I'm trying to translate from one language to another, and let's say the language is Yagua, a language spoken in Peru that has been claimed to have 5 past tenses. English only has 1 past tense, so I have to know what past tense to put it in, the one that means close to the present, a little bit farther away from the present, historical time. You know, how do I do that? I can figure it out. It just means that when talking quickly, there could be a lot of confusion because I don't have the categories. It's always difficult for people who speak English to learn the genders of languages like German and Portuguese and Spanish and other languages. It doesn't mean they can't learn it. It just means they have to start thinking differently because they don't think in terms of we do think in terms of genders, we just don't think in terms of marking it in our language in English. So language definitely in our day-to-day operations, our day-to-day lives, and the quick performance of tasks affects the way we think. There's no question about that. That's well demonstrated. But it is not demonstrated, and in fact the opposite has been shown, that if you speak one language and I speak another, we can never think alike. In fact, we can communicate. We can figure these things out. In a sense, it's just the foods. It's like the foods we like. It's like somebody from China may like foods that somebody from California just can't stand, and vice versa. But it doesn't mean they're incapable of eating each other's foods. It just means, one is very comfortable eating a type of food that another one is not. And I see language as very similar to this.
Mm-hmm. But those types of effects that language can have on our thinking, they are usually not permanent, in the sense that if people are exposed to another language or another culture where people speak and think about the same things but in a different way, they are able to learn it. Correct?
Yes, as long as you're aware that such differences exist. It requires a little bit of reflection. One reason that so many people have difficulties in learning other languages is because learning to speak another language, in a sense, means learning to think about the world slightly differently. And if you think that the way that you think and the way that you eat, the way that you speak are the only options, then it becomes more difficult and becomes a threat to your identity. So if you enjoy all these alternatives, so we know that bilinguals have great advantages over monolingual people. The more languages you speak, cognitively, the better off you are in operating in the world. There are a number of advantages to speaking multiple languages.
Because maybe you have a more fluid kind of thinking process or something like that.
You have more thinking options. You can describe a situation in different ways. Using very different processes. So if I'm speaking Pirahã and I'm telling you I saw a monkey, there will be a suffix on the verb that tells you whether the monkey was higher than me or lower than me or level with me or on the other side of the river. So all of this is part of the verb. I'm not used to saying that, although I can say, oh yeah, he was above me. But I wouldn't necessarily put it in the verb, and it wouldn't even be important. So the Pirahã naturally communicate more information about the things they're talking about than we do, because they have to be marked like that in the verb. It doesn't mean we can't think about it. It just means we don't tend to pay attention to all those details that they do pay attention to.
So before we go, let me ask you a little bit about the Pirahã. So, first of all, what kind of society are we talking about?
We're talking about a hunter-gatherer, egalitarian, somewhat anarchic society. There is no leadership. Nobody tells anybody else what to do. They stay together in a mutually cooperative environment where each helps the other. There's very little competition. People take care of each other. They share things with each other. So in that sense, they are a perfect, I wouldn't call them communist in the sense that there's no private property, because there definitely is private property, but it's not a big deal. Like if you can have something and you call it yours, I may decide to take it. You will definitely notice that I've taken it, and you might complain to me about it, but that's the end of it. There's no punishment and no sense of, you violated the law of some sort. Maybe I'll take it back from you next time you're not looking. But they are socialist in the sense that they share with each other, and a group value is to take care of other people in the group. So if I need to go hunting and I have small children, anybody in the group is happy to take care of them. They just belong to the village. They're going to stay with me most of the time, but everybody has responsibility, in a sense, for everybody else in the village up to a point. So in that sense, they're very cooperative, very peaceful society. They really enjoy life. They do a lot of talking and laughing. It doesn't take that long to get the food that they need. It takes a man 15, 20 hours a week of work to provide all that he needs to provide for his family. Maybe his wife, again, works 15 to 20 hours a week, but most of the time they do what they want to do.
Mm-hmm. And are there any aspects of their culture that maybe highlight the way they think about things, about the world, their worldview, and things like that that you would like to tell us about?
Well, I mean, I've discussed in detail a principle that I call the immediacy of experience principle, which is an organizing function of the entire society to talk about the things that are within my control or that I have seen or someone else has seen, not to speculate about the past or the future. This doesn't mean that they don't know about the past or don't know about the future. It's just that there's no point in talking about the distant future. I might say that tomorrow I'm going to go fishing, but there's no point in me saying that in 10 years I'm going to do X, because first, they don't count years, they don't count numbers. I mean, they have no numerical system. And second, those are just irrelevant. How do I know what I'm going to be doing in 10 years? So I talk about what I can do, what I can control. This means that there's not a lot of time spent on regretting the past or fearing the future. And I think this is linked to a very high degree of happiness among the people. And that's one respect in which I admire them tremendously.
So you referred to the fact that they lack numbers, right? But don't they even have numbers for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5? Because it is frequent that people in more traditional societies at least have numbers up to 4 or 5 or something like that, and then they simply say many or some.
Yeah, that is true. That's common. 1, 2, many. 1, 2, 3, many. The Pirahã, however, don't even have the number 1. And this has been shown by a series of experiments. When I first made this claim, it was obviously very controversial to say that a group doesn't even have the number 1. But researchers from Stanford, from Berkeley, from MIT, from Columbia University and the University of Miami all have done their own separate experiments there and have concluded that that's correct. They don't even have the number 1.
Mm-hmm. That's very interesting. So, and in terms of their language, I mean, during the interview, you already said that it lacks recursion, they don't have numbers, they don't talk about the future. Are there any other specific traits that the Pirahã language has that distinguishes it from the languages we are used to?
Well, sure. They have the simplest kinship system known. They only have, generation above, my generation, generation below. There's no word for mother or father. There's a word for parent. There's no word for grandfather or grandmother. There's just, big parent. So this is unusual. They don't have creation myths. They don't talk about when the world was created. They don't have obvious fictional stories. So when we go into the Pirahã, we really are entering into a society that has developed independent of our own values and our own social roles and our own knowledge structures for such a long period of time that we're really able to test two things more effectively than we could test them in other societies, which is how similar humans are and how different humans are. Because, often when people talk about the psychic unity of man, for example, a very popular idea, they're basing this on the comparison of cultures that are very similar or that have had a lot of contact. But if you start to look at cultures that are very different, cultures that have had very little contact with the outside world, and I've talked to anthropologists who work with isolated hunter-gatherer groups in different parts of the world, such as Malaysia and New Guinea, Indonesia, who find a lot of similarities between what they're observing and the Pirahã, in my descriptions of the Pirahã. And, if I had time, I always get invited to visit these other groups around the world and these other hunter-gatherer groups. But these days, I simply don't have time to take off 3 months and go visit another group because it takes at least 2 weeks to get to some of these places, and then you've got to stay there for 3 weeks. And but I don't find much evidence for the psychic unity of man. I find that cultures vary a lot more than that hypothesis would lead us to think, although we clearly are physically similar. So we expect to have and we have the same emotional bases in our brains, the same emotional regions. So we expect to find a lot of similarities about humans, but whether we want to call those, in Bastian's sense, a psychic unity or just cultural overlap based on physiological similarity, I don't find the psychic unity hypothesis particularly insightful.
Mm-hmm. So just one last question. How and why did you get to study the Pirahã? And what were some of your main motivations to do that?
Well, I only had one motivation originally. I went there as a missionary to translate the Bible for them. I was a strong evangelical Christian. And in the course of my work and in my attempt to talk to them about the Bible and and to do translation, I began to realize that this was unnecessary. They had the characteristics that the Bible should have given them, which is happiness and peace. And they had all this stuff. They didn't need the gospel, the Christian gospel, to figure this stuff out. And they also required more evidence than I had. As they talk about things they've seen, things they can control. Certainly something that happened 2,000 years ago that nobody's seen is outside of their evidentiary requirements. I eventually, abandoned whatever metaphor you want to use. I realized I was wrong, and I stopped the religious talk, and I'm an atheist. But my motivation then became very quickly the scientific aspects of the language, because these were fascinating to me, and understanding this culture and understanding this language became my greatest motivations. And so over the next 30 years, and of all the stuff I've written on them over the years, a lot of material, it's been motivated from just simply trying to figure out how the culture works and how the language works.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. So, Dr. Everett, before we go, I've already referred to two of your books in the introduction to the interview. Would you like to refer to some of other sources on the internet or elsewhere where people can get in touch with your work?
Yes, so I have a website, daneverettbooks.com, which has a lot of material. I am getting ready with Christian Saunders to start producing a regular podcast on language and culture called The Story of Language, which people will be able to locate. And then probably the book that best describes the Pirahã and my relationship to them is Don't Sleep, There Are Snakes, which is, tends to be the book that people who are not interested in the science of language or culture enjoy the most.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. So I will be leaving links to all of that in the description box of the interview so that people can go and check it out. And Dr. Everett, it was a real pleasure to have you on the show and to talk to you. So thank you very much again for accepting the invitation.
Thanks very much for having me. Yeah, it was great to talk to you.
Hello everybody, thank you for watching this interview until the end. As you might have noticed, I've been doing regular interviews with academics and intellectuals from a variety of fields. So to keep the channel sustainable, I would really like to ask you to please visit my Patreon page and to consider making a pledge there. Any amount, even just $1, would already be a great help. Otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, you can also support me via Subscribestar or PayPal. And please share the video, leave a like and hit the subscription button. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my patrons and PayPal supporters, Karin Litska, Anne Blanchett, Perelga Larsen, Lau Guerrero, Chantel Gelinas, Francis Ford, Hans Fredrik Sunda, Brian Rivera, Lucas Stafiniak, Sergio Condriano, Janne Henninen, Ricardo Vladimiro, Craig Healy, John Connors, Adam Castle, Vega Gidi, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Wiesel, David Diaz, Annie Ancata, Jacob Klinkby, Dr. Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Rutger Voss, and Bo Weingard. And also my three producers, Isar Webbe, Rosie, and Jim Frank. Thank you for all.